So the hymn says, "Blessed One, whether you are born of Kronos, Zeus, or Rhea, I loudly hail thee, Attis. You the Assyrians call thrice desired Adonis. All Egypt calls you Osiris. Samothracians call you Adamos. The Phrygians call you Papus, a corpse, a god, unfruitful, goatherd, green year of harvested grain, fruitful, almond-born, and player of the pipes." This is a pre-existing hymn to Attis that the Nicene preacher is using to allegorically read as a reference to Jesus. And he shows you the light of Christ shining through Attis. They are responding to Greek mysteries and integrating the knowledge that they have from the Greek mysteries into their understanding of Christianity, and in effect, seeing the Greek mysteries as equivalent to Jewish prophecies, that is, as symbolically referring to Christ. The Phrygian Attis is referred to as both a corpse and a god. And when he goes to explain that, he then refers to Christ's resurrection and his transformation from the resurrection of the dead to become a god. And he says that Paul also experienced this on his trip to the third heaven. Paul was deified.
I find that particularly fascinating. And that's clearly his belief.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. Today I'm joined by M. David Litwa, and if you haven't joined by now, join his Patreon because it is the best resource for knowledge of the ancient world, religions, comparative mythology, and most of all, Christian origins, non-commodity texts. If you love all that stuff, go and it's in the description. Click on that. As low as $3 a month, and you're getting the best. You're getting the best of the best. And welcome to Gnostic Informant, M. David Litwa. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Neil. Doing good. Happy to be here and very excited to talk about the Nassines. This is episode 25 that I'm putting together for the Found Christianity series, and it's based on about 26. There's about 26 slots in the series, and the most of the content is exclusive to the Patreon. So hop on there if you're interested. The Nassines are really, to many, really the most fascinating group of all, because they are the most interactive with the data from Greco-Roman culture. And I'm just going to give you a teaser for what you can expect when you read the Nassines. It is a real head trip, so be prepared. So the Nicene preacher is responsible for a treatise that we have, and we think, or I think I should say, he lives late 2nd century, possibly early 3rd. He probably led a celibate sect of Christians who claimed to be the only true Christians. And this is really important because, most of the time they don't self-identify like this. But this guy says not only is he a Christian, but he and his group are the only true Christians. And that's really striking. But what really interests the people about the Nassines is, again,
I find that really fascinating. They're the only true Christians, right? How many denominations believe that today? Roman Catholics do. Mormons do. This is the common faith, right? Even the Talmudic Jews believe they're right, even though the Samaritans have been performing a Pesach for thousands of years in the correct city.
Their engagement, really heavy, vibrant engagement with Greek mystery cults. And more than any other single Christian group, they are responding to Greek mysteries and integrating the knowledge that they have from the Greek mysteries into their understanding of Christianity. And in effect, seeing the Greek mysteries as equivalent to Jewish prophecies, that is, as symbolically referring to Christ and their understanding of Christ. But in the meantime, they bring you through a wild ride for how they come to that conclusion.
Interesting.
So just real quick about some of their ethics, their rights, and their thought. There's so much on this, and I have to be really brief here, folks.
Sure.
But we know that they practice a ritual of initiation that is like a Christian baptism, except they called the baptismal water living water. We don't know exactly what they meant by that, but that's what they called it. And they also had, after the baptism, a rite of anointment, and they called their ointment ineffable. So not only would you be baptized, you would be covered with some kind of oil. And possibly, we don't know for sure, but possibly you would be given milk or honey to consume after this ritual. And you would also be asked to commit to celibacy. Now, there's some controversy about this, but I'm pretty sure myself that this group is very much on the celibacy track. And I've talked about some characters in the Fun Christianity series who also are on this track. What's interesting about the Nassenes is, and one of the reasons that we know they're kind of late in the 2nd century, is that they combine or amalgamate information that they get from other early Christian sects. So the Ophites, who are again on the Patreon, they refer to the god human, and that is a divinized human, actually not divinized, just the true God who is called human with a capital H, and he's always been God, or she's always been God. They insist on androgyny. And also reference to the angelic church. This is something that the Valentinians also.
Well, that's fascinating too. Because if you look at some of the things about what they claim about Jesus, he would have had to have been androgynous to fulfill the statements they're saying.
Also made reference to. So there are, in a sense, the Nicene preacher is combining his knowledge of Ophite theology with what we might call Valentinian ecclesiology. And it's these hints that give us the sense that this figure is speaking fairly late in the 2nd century. And that's important because the person who gives us the report, called the Refutator, writer of the Refutation of All Heresies, thinks that the Nacenes are the earliest of all Christian heresies, even earlier than Simon of Samaria. And he thinks that this is the archetypal Christian heresy. Okay.
Wow.
And he gets that because he thinks that the heresy comes from Satan or the snake. And the Nacenes are named after the Hebrew word for snake, which is Nachash. So that's where, when it's transliterated into Greek, it becomes.
And there it is. The word for the group that worshipped his mystic knowledge called themselves the serpent Nahash. And we'll get into that. So keep that in mind.
naas, and then hence you get naasins. The refutator, however, made clear that that's not necessarily what they called themselves. They called themselves the only true Christians, but they also called themselves Gnostics in the sense of knowers. Okay. One of the really striking things about all of this is this radical cosmopolitanism. In other words, whereas a common Christian in the 2nd century and even today would be looking to the Jewish prophecies to get information about Christ and to read everything symbolically or allegorically, what the Nicene preacher does is he turns to other Greco-Roman rites and rituals. But really, his scope is even broader than that. Essentially, he looks at all reality as a simple system of truth and as confirming his own Christian ideology, we might say. And some of the things that he comes up with is pretty amazing. So I'd like to look a little bit more at his allegorical practice, just so you get a sense and a taste of this. So he allegorizes not just Jewish and Christian scripture, but Hellenic cult texts. And as I said, he's able to find Christ, whom he calls typically the child of the human, who inhabits all people. He's able to find this in the cultic descriptions, specifically of the god Attis. Now, Attis is a Phrygian deity who was driven crazy or mad by the goddess Cybele, which led him on his wedding day to cut off his own testicles. And
that's just gold, right? Matthew 19:12. What does he command of those who follow him? Cut off yourself. Let's read it. For there are eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men. And there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of Uranus. He who is able to accept this, let him accept it. So that they're cutting themselves off for their god Uranus.
he then bled out underneath a pine tree. This pine tree then signifies his sort of everlasting life, because Attis, although he bleeds out, never really dies. His pinky, it said, is always twitching. And there's a lot more we can say about Attis, but
wow,
that's the basic rundown. He becomes a very popular deity both in Roman Asia Minor and in Rome. He's an official Roman deity.
If I'm not mistaken, isn't he in Ovid's Metamorphosis?
Well, it's been a while since I've read Ovid's Metamorphosis, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
But he's in many descriptions, and I can offer, if your viewers are interested, I can offer a reading list. Essentially, if you look up this chapter in Found Christianities, you'll find all that you ever could want about Attis.
And by the way, while we're on that subject, if they sign up for the Patreon, they get a deal on the book, right?
Absolutely. So you'll get 20% off. There's a code that I supply in the Patreon. So grab that code and you can use that to get some money off.
There you go.
Now, Attis, as a Greco-Roman god, has hymns that are sung to him. And what the Nicene preacher does is he takes a hymn that was originally sung in honor of Attis, and he gives a theological commentary on it, so that he shows you that it is really Christ who is the subject of the hymn. And I'm just going to give you my translation of this
this is so interesting, this idea of Gnostic universalism. This is what the New Testament is actually teaching. You look at Acts 19:19, what does Paul say? Sorry, it's Acts 17:23, when he's speaking to the Greeks. For a while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship. I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. And remember, I told you, I totally believe Luke Acts is high-level allegory. Why is, therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. So he's proclaiming the unknown God to them. Now look at Deuteronomy 13. It says, if a prophet or dream arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, the sign of the wonder comes true concerning which he spoke to you. Let us walk after other gods whom you have not known. So it's an unknown God. Let us serve them.
Him and read it for you so that you can get an idea of what is the Nicene preacher actually doing. So the hymn says, "Blessed One, whether you are born of Kronos, Zeus, or Rhea, I loudly hail thee, Attis. You the Assyrians call thrice desired Adonis. All Egypt calls you Osiris. Samothracians call you Adamos. The Phrygians call you Papus, a corpse, a god, unfruitful, goatherd, green ear of harvested grain, fruitful, almond-born, and player of the pipes."
Wait, hold on. Pause for a second. Who said this? Who wrote, where is this from?
This is a pre-existing hymn to Attis that the Nicene preacher is using to allegorically read as a reference to Jesus.
Wow. Just wow. Because is this like from Orphic Mysteries or somewhere? Is this some sort of hymn that everyone knows about, or is he just pulling? Is unknown? Like, do you know where this actually comes from?
Well, we don't have independent attestation of this particular hymn, but it's definitely written by a devotee of Attis.
Sure.
That probably lived anywhere from, say, 3rd century BCE to the late 2nd century. We don't know how old the hymn is, but we know it was sung in honor of Attis.
Well, what's so striking about this is the syncretism that's involved here. He's saying you're the son of Kronos, who is time, basically. He's the beginning of everything. And then he's saying you are called Adonis, okay? That's another dying and rising god, by the way, which is interesting. But you got Osiris. And then he's naming, isn't that a syncretism right there? What do you...
You could call that syncretism. I would just call it's a very hybrid concept of deity. I would call it universalizing. I would call it a cosmopolitan universalizing understanding of deity. What this author is trying to do is trying to say that Attis exists in all religions. And so what the Nicene preacher does is he then goes and says, no, actually, Attis here refers to Christ. Therefore, Christ exists in all religions. That's his intellectual move.
Too good. All right, I'm sorry. I cut you out. Continue.
That's okay. Well, probably the best way for me to give you an example for how the Nicene preacher works is simply to quote a section from the Nicene preacher to give you a sense for how his mind works. And it truly is a beautiful mind, although it does definitely go in all different kinds of directions. So this is a quote that I've translated here from the Refutation. He says, "These very Phrygians," that is the Phrygian worshippers of Attis, "say that this same human," referring to Jesus, "becomes a god, again, by transformation. He becomes a god when he rises from the dead and through such a gate enters heaven, The Apostle Paul knows this gate since he opened it in a mystery. He said that he was seized by an angel and carried as far as the second and third heaven into paradise, and saw what he saw and heard unutterable utterances. Now, if you go back to the actual hymn, you'll see that the passage which the Nicene preacher is commenting on is this passage which says that the Phrygian Attis is referred to as both a corpse and a god. And when he goes to explain that, he then refers to Christ's resurrection and then his transformation from the resurrection of the dead to become a god. And he says that Paul also experienced this on his trip to the third heaven. Paul was deified on his way to the third heaven. So that's how this author works.
Paul was deified. This is what the Hosh teaches, right? Eat my flesh, drink my blood, and you shall become as gods.
Takes a hymn, which is probably pre-Christian, and he essentially he reads it in light of his own revelation from classic biblical texts, what we think of as scriptural texts, and he shows you the light of Christ shining through Attis. Now, there's so much more to this particular sermon. The Nicene preacher, we usually call his writing a sermon, and most of it survives in the Refutation of All Heresies. Most recently translated by me. You can find this on Amazon. But it is a wild ride, and I hope that your viewers leave plenty of comments so that we can get into the nitty-gritty of understanding this most fascinating of all early Christian groups.
Wow, this is awesome. So it's time for questions, right?
Fire away.
All right. So my first question is, where does this idea that Paul entered heaven and got deified? Where does that come from? Is this their idea and they just kind of made this up, or is he getting this from some sort of Gnostic scripture that exists somewhere?
Nope, it's not Gnostic scripture at all. It's simply 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul says that he knows a guy who took a trip to the third heaven, referring, of course, to himself, as most people take that. And on his trip to the third heaven, he entered paradise. And what the Nicene preacher is doing is he's saying, well, that entrance into heaven or into celestial ecology demanded that Paul's body, like Christ, be transformed into something that can survive in a transcendent realm. And that is his deification. So he gets some kind of new or spirit body that is immortal and doesn't die and has information to mysteries. And that combination of immortality and superhuman knowledge is deification.
Yeah, I just looked up the verse. I just wanted to see it. And it says, although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things. Oh yeah, this is where he's getting that from. I don't remember reading it this way. I thought this was more, I don't know, I thought this meant something else, but that sort of makes sense to how they're understanding it. That Paul does seem like he's claiming to be having gone to heaven. Enochian.
Absolutely. That's what he says.
That's crazy. So the other question was, is there any other groups besides the Nacenes who do this sort of syncretism that sort of identify Jesus as like being like Osiris and Attis and all these other deities, or is it just them?
Well, so the Nacenes are the most thorough in their claim for that Jesus is referred to in these other Greco-Roman cults. But there are others, definitely, and we're going to talk about the Sethians, the so-called Sethians in the Refutation of All Heresies, who do something similar, except they use Orphic mysteries instead of Attic or the mysteries of Attis, the Phrygian mysteries. So definitely they're not alone. But the Nicene preacher is, I mean he is, and I say this with all absolute due respect, but he is a genius of his time. He is able, whereas most Christians would run away screaming from the mysteries of Attis, this author is able to integrate all of Greco-Roman religion into his understanding of Christ, and that's an amazing accomplishment.
Yeah, that's my kind of guy right there. Like that kind of. But does he? Do they call themselves the Nacenes? Because that's like a serpent name. Do they actually call themselves that, or is that an outside? Is that like the Phoenicians, like the purple people? But they don't call themselves that, but they're just called that. Is it the same thing like that?
Seems like an outsider designation. Yep.
Sure. It's interesting. And last thing, does he have a real name, this preacher, or we just don't know who he is?
Yeah, one of the great tragedies of heresiological reporting, because we get this material quoted in a heresiological text.
That's true.
The author does not, either the Nicene preacher never named himself, or the author of the Refutation simply omitted his name. So that is simply why he's called the Nicene preacher. And I hope to God sometime we get to know his name, but right now he is one of the many nameless geniuses of early Christianity.
That's awesome. That's one of the mysteries. But yeah, that is it for that. And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have.
It's a fascinating take. 1 Samuel 11. About a month later, Nahash, the Ammonites and Moabites are the fatherless ones, went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a treaty with us, and we will serve you." But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, "On this condition I will make a treaty with you, namely that I gouge out everyone's right eye." It's an interesting, this right eye symbology that many Christians see in the esoteric, in the Freemasons, but they don't see it from their own idolatry. Matthew 5:29, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into Hela, which is actually here, Gehenna, which is the fires outside of Jerusalem when it was conquered. Galatians 4:15. What has become of the goodwill you felt? For I testify that had been possible, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. So we see this common theme, right? Nahash asking for the right eye, Yesu asking for the right eye, and Paul asking for the eyes. Isn't it interesting that snakes are blind? They can't see with their eyes. Isn't it interesting? In the garden, what does he say? Now the serpent, Nahash, was more crafty than any other wild animal that Jehovah God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say to you, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" And the woman said to Nahash, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, nor shall you die." And it's interesting, there's this bit of mystery about why Eve added to the command an oral tradition that's not in what Jehovah told Adam, that touching it leads to death. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die. That's the lie, right? For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, ascending to the Most High. Matthew 15, when the Pharisees are washing their hands, because that's a terrible thing to do. Washing your hands before you eat? Why are you following the traditions of men? And what does he say to them? Verse 11, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles. This is Gnosticism. But also, look at 11a. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person. It's literally what Nahash told Eve, that eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil will not defile you. You will not die. You will be as a god. But let's go on. John 6:56. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. And he says here that you shall be as gods by eating my flesh and drinking my blood. This is what the mystery cults believed before Christianity. The cult of Dionysus practiced theophagy and had meals consisting of the blood of Dionysus. And obviously it wasn't the actual blood. It's like Christians freak out when I say that this is an abomination. It's not actual blood. It doesn't matter. Psalm 16:4. Those who choose another god multiply their sorrows, and their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out or take their names upon my lips. And that's Exodus 23:13, by the way. And remember, in Exodus 3:15, Jehovah says his name, his everlasting name, his forever name is Jehovah. A name that the Talmudists have tried to hide, a name that Christians have tried to replace and hide. Isaiah 14:12. Oh, how you have fallen from heaven, O morning star. And most translations don't translate that correctly, the Halel Shachar, the son of the morning star, the son of the dawn, right? How you are cut down from ground, who you laid the nations low. He tried to ascend to heaven to make himself like God. Morning star. And this is why most of your translations don't translate this, because it becomes perfectly obvious who is being talked about now. The son of the morning star. Revelation 22:16. It is I, Yesu, who sent my angel to you, and this testimony for the churches. I am the root of the descendant of David, the Moabitess, the bright morning star. The bright morning star is Venus, which would make him a fallen angel. The purveyor of wisdom, Nahash. But trust in Jehovah alone. Don't trust in any man, son of man, or any religion. Seek out Jehovah, heed his voice, keep his commands. Shalom.